Thank you, Diana, for those kind remarks. It's the old Hahnemann, my father would have been proud and my mother would have believed them. So maybe we could dim the lights. This is a very data-rich presentation, but I promise not to terrorize you too much with it. We are going to, no, this is Francois' presentation. So while they bring that up, I'm going to start the stopwatch here so I know. Okay. Okay. Let me just, this is not the correct presentation, but let's just wait a minute. So about 3 years ago, I got a call from an American defense planner. And they had a peculiar set of questions. The first question was, do you guys know anything about this energy transition? And I said, well, what did you have in mind? Well, the first question is, are the energy models as bad as the war-fighting models? And I said, well, that's something we could look into, but probably they're worse from what our own experience is. And he said, the second question is, you know, if you're a defense planner, you'd like to know how the world might really turn out, not about the aspirational goals of the energy transition. So some of these graphs and data I'm going to show you today is drawn from that work over the last 3 years. We are, as Diana said, we're a public policy think tank. We focus on petroleum issues and energy security. We have a long relationship with the Institute of Energy Economics Japan on the future of LNG throughout the Pacific Rim. I won't say much more than that. You know, and one of the questions I'd like us to sort of address today is, you know, among all these that are on this list here is, we are facing a time in which we sort of have unwarranted optimism about the pace of this energy transition. To undertake this energy transition is an enormous effort, and it's largely focused in the West or in the developed world. If you travel to the less developed world, they are not buying what the OECD is selling. In other words, they want cheap, affordable, reliable, secure energy. I want to say just a few things about models for a second. And because, you know, in the policy business, people rely heavily on models. And they tend to believe that they might be, you know, right or tell you about the future. But in fact, what we know about models is they're all wrong, but some of them are useful. I'm going to talk a little bit about that today, because it's going to help sort of frame your thinking about the energy transition. Now, the first thing you know when you look at the future, you look at how people model the future, is you see that there's enormous uncertainty. And these models here show you, and some of them are quite complex and quite elaborate, but they have tremendously different outcomes looking into the future. In fact, we were able to replicate the sort of business as usual model of the IEA with just 4 variables. So the complexity of the models is no guarantee that they're going to be more informative. This is a very interesting chart. By the way, this is from data from the Energy Information Agency. And all I want you to take from these charts here, each of them shows a future China, okay, so it shows China oil demand in the future. So each box is a look out 15 to 20 years. And what you can see from that, EIA kept running their model over and over and over. And the gray band is supposed to be the band at which all outcomes, or 95% of outcomes, occur. As you can see, year after year, they consistently missed predicted oil consumption in China. So the only lesson from all this is that you really can't rely on the models as an accurate foretelling of what the future is going to look like. There are too many variables and too many uncertainties. Now, if you don't have a model that you like, you can use this model. And this model shows all the plans the US has had for renewable fuels going back to the 1960s. Different programs, Amory Lovins, different governments. But even after 20 years of working on all these renewable plans, 4% of US primary energy comes from wind and solar. In fact, worldwide, we know over the last 20 years, about $5 trillion has been sent in direct subsidies for solar, wind, and biofuels. Yet, after $5 trillion in 20 years, worldwide, only about 5% of world energy consumption is from wind, solar, and biofuels. The other point I want to make is this particular chart shows that between 2010 and 2020, the United States produced enough oil, incremental oil, to meet 84% of world incremental demand. So for the United States, oil and gas is not just an instrument of prosperity, it's instrument of national power, and it's an instrument of wealth creation. So one issue that you have to confront is if you're going to remove these instruments of national power and wealth creation for a substitute which may or may not work, you have to understand how risky that alternative might be. The other interesting thing about the US, and the red section of this graph shows you net exports. So the blue shows you the imports, the red shows you the exports, and you can see that the United States, even though it imports a lot of oil and oil products, it exports a lot of oil and oil product and is a net exporter to the world market of 2 million barrels a day. In fact, the Western Hemisphere is going to disconnect from the world oil market in terms of production. Now, we will still be connected by prices, but with Guyana, Brazil, Colombia, the US, Canada, Mexico, we are not going to be a net drain on the world oil market. We're going to be a net supplier. So how hard is the transition? This shows you population growth in the coming years. And you can see here that vast amounts of this production, vast amounts of the population is going to take place Asia Pacific and in the African continent, which Francois is going to talk a little bit about later. But here the key point is these parts of the world are the parts of the world we're going to see massive economic growth. They are largely energy poor, and as they grow and as their economies expand, they're going to have enormous demand for dense energy supplies. If you take a look at this graph here, you can see in the lower left-hand corner, these are the countries of Asia, non-OECD Asia, partly the Middle East is a little better. And where do they all want to be? Africa. They all want to have kilowatt-hour consumption like we do in the West, in the developed world. And in order to get from there to these higher levels of consumption, they're going to need vast investments and new supplies of energy. Another interesting point is, if you look at non-OECD Asia, and you look at these vast economies, Malaysia, Indonesia, all through the Far East, you can see they are still coal-based. They use a lot of coal. And their interest in giving up that coal is only if you can come with something more effective. I traveled all throughout Asia, Yeah, Indonesia. Take about Indonesia. There are almost 300 million people in Indonesia. It's hot. Everybody wants air conditioning. And when they hear from somebody from Denmark who says, 1 minute. All right, so what I want to leave you with then is this here. Just because you go away from oil and gas and you move to some alternative like electric vehicles, it is not a guarantee of energy security or affordability. This particular chart shows you that we face the same kind of risks, but in technologies which don't perform as well in things like electric cars. As you can see, the battery prices for batteries for the Tesla have risen dramatically. And so we're going to have a lot of issues having to do with critical materials. So now, in the Western Hemisphere, particularly the United States, we are energy independent. We are major exporters to the world market. And we have a policy which is trying to shift us to reliance on a new set of materials. Here, these are, the red shows all the different stages of critical materials dominated by China. And you can see in this final chart here that all the red are parts of the world, many very hostile to the West, in which these critical materials exist where they're processed. So Diana, I'll leave it at that point.
All right, thanks very much. Now we're honored to have François Baird to talk about food security.
Thank you, Diana, and thank you for the invitation. Since we've just had lunch, why don't we talk about food a little bit? Who here has had a barbecue? Ever? Put up your hand. Have you had a barbecue? Who's not had a barbecue? Everyone's had a barbecue. Okay, second question. Who here gets a regular meal cooked at home on an electric stove or gas stove? Everyone. If this were Africa, there'd be a difference. Very few people would have their meal cooked on an electric stove or gas stove. And that, in essence, is what I'm going to talk about today. It's energy access. It's one thing to talk about security, energy security, in terms of generation and distribution. But the real problem is to talk about its relationship to access for ordinary people. Everyone here who is in the political world and representing constituents, everything you do has an effect, particularly when you do nothing. And therefore, we need to look at how energy access plays a role in food security and stability, because as a representative of the people and as a servant of the people, governments have to answer an exam question. And this is the exam. How to stop hunger, create jobs, and improve people's wealth. Because without that, there's no stability. Only if you create jobs, improve people's wealth, and there's no hunger, will you have stability. And, you know, since I'm from Africa, let me explain something. 600 million people in the fastest growing continent in the world, demographically, have no access or lack access to electricity. So while people are talking about alternative energy, they are not interested. They're simply interested in having access to electricity. Even The country where I was born, South Africa, which is the most industrialized country in Africa, is going through an electricity supply crisis. I checked just before I got on the stage here, and at my flat in Johannesburg, there's no power at the moment. They call it load shedding, rotational power cuts. Many people in the developing world live with that. So we have to increase access to energy, and most people, certainly in Africa, don't care where the energy comes from. They simply want to be part of modern society. They want factories and mines to provide jobs. They want their own wealth to increase, and they want home-cooked meals, not having to choke on open fires and coal-fired stoves. So, is it any wonder then that if you look at a map of fragile states, most fragile states, and the most fragile states, are in Africa? How do you change that? What's at the heart of a fragile state? At the heart of a fragile state is the inability to provide sufficient electricity and power. That's at the heart of a fragile state. And these pictures are not improving. Even South Africa, which used to be a very stable state, is becoming more and more fragile. The most industrialized country in Africa. The country with the most people, Nigeria, all you have to do is look at the map and you'll see it's in red. It's a fragile state. The biggest country in Africa, the Democratic Republic of Congo, is a fragile state. Even small countries like Malawi, a fragile state. What do they have in common? What they have in common is that their people lack access to energy, to electricity and fuel. Therefore, what we at Fair Play are advocating for is that legislators and executive governments should start seeing the interplay between energy, food security, and stability. And instead of hoping people would eat ideology, or heat their homes, or cool their homes with good thoughts, their very job is to make sure that there's energy access for all the people in the country, so that there can be food security. Because only then will there be stability and no fragile states. Why do I talk about food security? Well, let me give you an example. Chicken is the most consumed meat in Africa. It's the protein source of the masses. It's the affordable thing for poor people and middle-income households. Where does a chicken start? A chicken basically is a corn cob with feathers on. It eats maize. To grow maize, you need tractors. To run tractors in distant corners of Africa, you need fuel. To produce chickens at scale, you need electricity. The biggest chicken producer in South Africa, which is one of the 6 most competitive poultry producers in the world, has just had to spend $10 million at one of their chicken farms to provide generators because there's no electricity available from the grid. As a result, many companies are experiencing this, and there's a shortage of the most popular meat. In addition, thousands of small chicken farmers have gone out of business. Surveys have shown that they have stopped producing poultry because they can't get access to electricity. Do you think that's a way to create stability? It's sheer lunacy. So what's to be done? Well, energy security should be at the heart of what governments do. Whether it's trade, and as a trade movement, the Fair Play movement is very concerned about the fact that internationally, for instance, big countries are using trade policy in ways that are outside the regulatory process and outside the rules that everyone had agreed, and as a result destroying access. They're also making aid available on terms that says, for instance, you may not finance oil, gas, coal in countries with an abundance of oil, gas, and coal, and their people have no access to energy. Now, how is that sensible? So we think there must be a reliable energy supply to industry. We think all of these trade and aid policies that are essentially predatory on the poor countries and the fragile states should become more sensible by allowing them to develop energy sources that they have readily available and are cheap. We need national and regional food security, particularly in Africa, because I showed you that map. We need agriculture and industry and innovation, but it can only happen if there's energy. We need to empower the rule of law institutions against corruption. This is very important, you see, and this is why you can't have a discussion about energy, particularly in Africa, unless you also understand that in Africa, corruption is causing a lot of the problems of providing energy access. So whether it's jobs, rural livelihoods, or supporting farmers and food producers, there's a very good reason why we do what we do, and why you, as lawmakers and government officials, should give attention to energy. Mothers and children need you. Thank you very much, Diana.